going to be talking about executive functioning, and this is Dr. Rush, who practices in the Atlanta area. Do you want to say a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I'm a psychologist with a private practice. We are in Tucker, and we're also in Dunwoody. I conduct lots of psychoeducational evaluations or psychological evaluations for issues ranging from learning disabilities to anxiety, depression, even adults with more severe and persistent mental health issues. One of my favorite things, because to discuss is executive functioning. I love this topic is because you can see the impact of deficits in this area in many of the disorders that I just talked about. And you can see executive functioning weaknesses in kids with attention disorders, but also anxiety disorders, or even kids with learning disabilities. And these strategies, they work for everyone. Even adults. And so the focus of today won't be adults necessarily, but improving executive functioning skills in children and adults, I think, can improve the overall, their overall functioning in day-to-day life. And so that's why I really love and enjoy this topic, and like teaching ways to build these skills in individuals.
Great, thank you. So what we're going to do for questions is, if anyone just wants to ask a question, they can unmute themselves and ask it. If you're not able to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and type a question in the chat box. So at the bottom, there's a little speech bubble with the chat bubble. You can click on that and type in there as well, and I will read those out loud when they come up. Does that sound good? Okay, so we can go ahead and get started.
Okay. So as I stated, we're talking about executive functioning skills, and executive functioning is just a fancy word for a set of skills that allow people to control and direct their behavior in a way that they can achieve long-term goals. I like to think of it as more of a mental self-regulation. So it helps us to manage our time and to pay attention to things when we need to pay attention to them, for as long as we need to pay attention to them, to plan and organize, to switch our focus to something more important when we need to avoid saying or doing the wrong things at the wrong time. And so these are very, very important skills that are controlled by an area of the brain called the frontal lobe. And I like to best describe executive functioning with an analogy, and I use this with parents all the time, and I think this is probably the one that is most helpful to them. With an air traffic control at any airport, it's really busy, okay? So there's, in any given airport, there's planes coming in. There are also planes that need to go out, sometimes all at the same time, but there's only a certain amount of space on the ground and in the air. And so the purpose of the air traffic control is to see everything and to direct and to slow up a plane that needs to approach the airport more slowly because, someone is not taking off fast enough, or there's not enough room on the ground. And so an airplane needs to circle the airport for another 20 minutes. And so they are seeing everything, and they're aware of not only the behaviors of the other planes, but they also have to be aware of their own behavior. And they have to resist any distractions in the background from, someone talking or something going on with the equipment that they're using that's impacting their ability to do their job. And so they are paying attention to all of these things at one time. And so this air traffic control is analogous to executive functioning, in that kids who who have very good executive functioning skills, it helps them to regulate the flow of information, maintain the focus they need on a task that they're trying to complete, creates mental priorities. I need to do this first, and then I can do this because this is due tomorrow versus something that's due next week, and helps to keep systems flexible when one approach isn't working and on time. And so it's the control center of the brain, essentially. So it's our brain CEO. So when kids do not have good executive functioning skills, they are more likely to be seen as behaving this way intentionally. So they're not doing their work because they are lazy or they are unmotivated. I told them to do it and they still haven't done it yet. And so they are defiant even. And so what ends up happening, because as parents, you don't want your kids to fail, you end up going to third grade again or fourth grade again, and you're doing their homework and you're sitting there with them when you would rather be doing something else, because they do not have the executive skills within themselves to get work done from start to finish. So it's the parent that comes in and acts as the CEO of the brain in order to compensate for these weaknesses. So I think this cartoon really illustrates it best when it says, my parents haven't cleaned my room in weeks and they say we're lazy. So that is what ends up happening. And it is my goal to help kids develop these skills independently and to get parents their life back.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about executive functioning skills, and this idea of putting these skills together in order to engage in a goal-directed behavior. So it's about the end result. We're trying to get to an end here, okay? So there are some behaviors that are fairly routine and some that are more complex. And so with routine tasks, like tying your shoe, for example, when you're younger, it is first a complex task, okay? But as you are taught to make 2 loops like bunny ears, to tie your shoes, and you do it every day the same way, and it eventually becomes a learned habit. So you don't have to think about it anymore. It's something that you know how to do. For adults, this would be like driving, a car to work. We don't really notice, that we're putting the gears in shape and we're pressing the brakes. It's something that we do automatically and routinely. Or cooking your favorite go-to meal. You don't need to measure out the salt and how much seasoning you need. It's something that you know how to do automatically. But let's think about more complicated goals. These are goals that are not routine. So these are the goals that, because they are difficult for us, they would require knowledge, planning, organization, use of certain strategies. For example, self-monitoring. What if you couldn't cook your go-to meal and you had to follow a recipe that you've never done before? Then you constantly look at the recipe, measure out. Do you see how your behavior would change when you are engaging in something that's fairly routine versus something that is more complex? It's nuanced. Or if your route to work there was a detour, it was blocked and you had to go in a new way. So you type in the directions into Waze or MapQuest, but now you'd be more cognizant of the signs, of the street signs, and reading, what street am I on? Is this the turn? You're not familiar with it. And so then all of a sudden it becomes more of a complex goal-directed behavior. Does that all make sense?
Definitely, yeah.
What we're wanting kids to do is to take these behaviors that are so complex and not necessarily in a fault of their own, they just don't have the executive skills. But something like sitting down to complete homework until it's done is really, really difficult for some kids. And it's not done in the same place, in the same way all the time. And so it continues to be a complex task. And what we want to do is to build habits around these behaviors and make them more routine so that they are performed more easily. Okay. Well, why is this even important? Executive or achieving some goal, and again, this is about goal-directed behavior, and achieving some sort of goal is in every single thing that we do all day, whether it's taking a shower or getting dressed for work or going grocery shopping and remembering to get everything on your list. It's all goal-directed. And so understanding this and looking at it as less of a problem that's intentional, and more of just ways that that we need to understand kids and develop these habits that we see lacking, or these skills that we see lacking, and develop habits around them so that they can perform the skills and get to the end goal more effectively. Okay. So there are a lot of executive functioning skills. And here I just sort of separate them in terms of, there are some that are more thinking or metacognitive in nature. So these are working memory, the ability to plan and prioritize things, organization, time management. But then there's also the ones that are doing sort of executive functioning skills, things that you can see, the ability to inhibit an impulsive response, like blurting out an answer rather than raising your hand. Sustaining attention, you can physically see how long a kid is able to sit and to work on a task for any amount of time. Task initiation is a big one, being able to just start, an assignment without being told. And then goal-directed persistence. So what I want to do, I go through each of these and talk about what it means and what it looks like when kids do not have this skill. But for the sake of time, and there's no slide associated with it, but for the sake of time, I will also, after I talk about what it looks like, throw out a few examples of when we're in individual sessions with kids, what are some of the things that we focus on and strategies that we use to teach and improve this particular executive function skill. And I'll just briefly touch on it. For example, so the first one here is working memory. Huge, as you can imagine. It's very, very important. Working memory is the capacity to hold and work with multiple pieces of information simultaneously. So I hear a lot, I give him 3 things to do, and he might remember the last thing, but then he turns around. And so the kid that has deficits in the area of working memory are forgetting to turn in their assignments. They are forgetting verbal directions right after you give them. They often need things repeated. A high school student, for example, a middle and high school actually, when they start to change classes, they really struggle with remembering the expectations and the homework for multiple teachers. And so just the sheer number of demands that they now have to keep up with is very, very difficult for them. And so with working memory, if we're working on executive skills directly, we like to really focus on this idea of offloading. And so this refers to the idea that the brain really doesn't have to work so hard or find space to remember, to do a particular homework assignment when you can actually write it down. But sometimes people forget to write things down. They forget to put things in their phone, and then they forget to look at it when it's time to do it. And so we end up, we have these strategies, but the strategies don't work. And so some of the things that we talk about, and sometimes writing things down, it does work, but for some people you need another type of strategy. So making to-do lists or having a whiteboard, my favorite one is having a whiteboard posted very clearly where everyone can see it so that you can know where what needs to be done and what you still have left to do. And you can check off things once it's done. One that I've used in the past are colored wristbands. And so you have a different wristband for every assignment. So maybe you have math on your wrist, science, history. And after you complete that homework assignment, you take it off or you switch it to the other hand. You can also do this with something that's hanging on the wall. And it really allows the student to visually see what has been done and what still needs to be done so that they can self-monitor in that way. Repeating directions. For example, with the 3 things, and he can only remember the first or the last, it's not helpful to say, you need to get your coat because remember it was cold yesterday and we didn't think it was going to be cold yesterday. And so I want you to go upstairs and get your coat, and also don't forget your gloves. And you also need your science project. Too many words, coat, gloves, science project. Do you need me to repeat it? Did you get it? Call them by name, simplify it, and even have them repeat it and rehearse it until they get their hands on what they are seeking, and they're more likely to get it done. Okay. Another one of my favorites that I like to use with adults, because surprisingly, executive function deficits and ADHD can really affect marriages. And, you know, mates don't really like when their partner can't remember to go get milk for the baby or Pampers, and they've said it a million times, but they always forget. And one of the things I like to do with adults is they're at work all day and they have every intention of going by and getting milk or getting the Pampers, but their reminder is on their phone and they forget to look at the reminder. And so if you're going to set a reminder on your phone, I always suggest that it's done at the point of performance. So the point at which you can actually perform that skill. And so if you have to go to the store to get milk and diapers and you get off work at 5 o'clock, you know, you're going to probably be driving by the store about 5:30. So you set a reminder in your phone at 5:30 to go get milk and Pampers. And that's the point at which you can actually go and perform that skill. Okay. So we work on things like this in order to help build these skills, you know, to improve the working memory. So to compensate for that, these weaknesses. Planning and prioritizing. The ability to create a roadmap to reach a goal or complete a task. Making decisions about what's important to focus on first. So kids who have trouble in this area, they really struggle with completing long-term assignments and projects, which you see a lot of in middle school and high school. They struggle with following a timeline to complete a task, working on lower priority tasks over higher priority ones. They're just not really good at that decision-making process, and can really use some help in using a calendar or a planner or an agenda to write out, you know, so here's a really big project that I have to do. I have to write a paper. Well, let's sit down and talk about what's all involved in writing this particular paper. Well, I have to do research, and, you know, so that's one task. I have to pick a topic, you know, that might be the first task. I have to brainstorm ideas. And so you break up a really large assignment into smaller, more manageable pieces, and then you create deadlines and timelines for those smaller pieces to make sure that by the end date that the entire project is done, okay? To limit procrastination and other pitfalls of having to sort of plan around a long-term assignment. Let's see. You guys can stop me at any time.
Yeah, if anyone has questions, they can unmute and just ask a question, or they can type it in the chat box. Sorry, go ahead.
The executive skill of organization, we can all see this very clearly when a kid lacks this ability to have a system and maintain a system to keep track of information and materials when you need it, and to be able to access this information. And so what this looks like is, you know, messiness and messy backpacks and messy desks. There's things everywhere. They have the folders in middle school with 6 subjects and everything is sticking out from all different places and you can't really find anything. They also have trouble taking notes, finding their notes. They are losing their cell phones, notebooks, because there's no consistent place to put anything. And so they can never find things when they need it. And so really, and there are some people that it's all messy, but if you ask for something, they absolutely know where it is. And so maybe for some people that works, but I think for most of us, having some sense of organization is more helpful. And so one of the things that we teach in terms of working on this, and sometimes we'll have kids come in and just dump out their backpacks. There's no consistent place for pencils and paper clips and a cell phone and notebooks for this subject and that subject. And so we will organize the notebook, and we will color code different subjects with tabs sticking out so that you can clearly see them labeled and go to that section efficiently. And even within a tab or within the science section, you have science notes, and then you might have science homework assignments. And so where you are organizing and you always know where to go and find things. With one particular student, she also had lots of activities that she had to go to. So sometimes, she had volleyball practice and she couldn't start an assignment at her normal time. And so we would have a calendar. So one of those notebooks where it's blank on the front where you can stick something in the pocket and it's visible. And so we just had the monthly calendar visible so that she could see where all of her soccer practices were, where her chorus, she sometimes would sing in the choir and she would have chorus practice, and she would work around that. Okay. So if she had something due on Thursday, but she was going to be out really late on Wednesday, we planned for her to not be able to get things done on Wednesday night because that has happened in the past. And so we plan around that. Time management. The ability to, really important, the ability to estimate how much time you have to do something or how much time to allocate to something, and then how to stay within limits and meet deadlines. I know as an adult, I write psychological reports, and I'm always so upset with myself at how long it took me to do something, just simply because I did not have any parameters set around, okay, so it should take me this long to do this, and I end up answering an email or a phone call, or rather than really taking the time to focus in, so it just takes way too long, way longer than it should. Well, kids are the same way. I think particularly kids with, and when we talk about these coexisting or comorbid conditions, because you can have executive skills deficits without having ADHD or some other condition, but individuals with ADHD almost always have executive skills deficits. And so lots of times you will see that these students are impaired just by their disability, attention deficit disorder, for example. And something that should take 20 minutes is taking an hour to complete. And I've heard parents say we sit there for 3 hours each night working on homework. First of all, that's too long. And not only in terms of environmental modifications, we also talk about school accommodations and environmental accommodations, teaching accommodations, things that might need to be changed, such as homework modifications for kids that have slower processing speed or attention deficits, and that won't allow them to focus on a page of 20 math problems. Maybe they have 10, but they sample all of the areas they need to assess. So that's another thing that we also focus on, but now we're just talking about, how the kid can sort of structure themselves to manage their time more effectively. So they have difficulty completing their homework assignments on time. They're always turning in things late, even when they're trying their best. And then again, something is taking way longer than it should. So this is one I work with a lot just because it's so common. In terms of what I tend to do with time management, I think being able to see your time and to see what you have to do, what you've already done and what you have left to do is very, very important. And so for this, what I will do is a whiteboard. I'm a big fan of whiteboards, but you can also use phones and any other type of thing to help you sort of see what it is you have to do. And at the back of, we'll see an example of this. In the back, I have some pictures of how this looks when I work with one particular kid. Using a whiteboard that says and talking to the kid, how long do you think it should take you to get this math study guide complete? And if they say 30 minutes, you say, okay, 30 minutes. And so from 7 to 7:30, you're going to work on this particular homework assignment. And maybe at 7:30, you take a break. No electronic breaks, but you'll take a stretching break, or you'll you'll get a drink of water. And so you put that on the whiteboard. Now let's talk about history. You have this chapter to read in history. How long do you think it should take you to read that? And so you are estimating the time that you think realistically it should take you to do an assignment. And on the whiteboard, you have the time you're going to do it from 7 to 7:30, the estimated time that it should take. And then at the end, you're going to write the time that it actually took to complete the task. Okay. I find that kids work, and this is the sustained attention part, they tend to work longer at something if they can see where the breaks are going to be built in. And so there's not some indefinite amount of time that I have to read this chapter. Mm-hmm. I am reading up until this point, and then I can take my break and get a drink of water or a snack. Response inhibition. The ability to resist the urge to do something that might have negative consequences, or something that's just simply more preferred. Difficulty waiting without being disruptive. So waiting in a lunch line without wiggling, skipping people, pushing people out the way, interrupting others and blurting out answers because you know the answer. Other kids don't like that, so it sometimes impacts social relationships with the know-it-all. And acting without thinking, so not being able to stop or control inappropriate behaviors. So maybe you're talking too loud when you're in church, or you are, going to play your video game when you have not finished your homework and it's due tomorrow. So you're putting off something, being able to put off something and delay gratification in order to complete some more important goal. So how do we do this? And again, this is sometimes exacerbated or made worse by kids who have ADHD, because poor inhibitory control is certainly a part of why these kids sometimes appear more impulsive and have more difficulty waiting than other kids, than their non-disabled peers. So, for example, something that a teacher could use with the kid who is always talking and calling out during circle time, or even during a class period where you're wanting kids to raise their hand rather than blurt out answers, is to use a talking stick. And so instead of, even if you do raise your hand, you have to have the talking stick in your hand before you can talk, okay? And so that really helps with that. Sometimes I had a kid once who would blurt out and get really upset because they were very uncomfortable with not understanding what was going on. And so when the teacher was giving a lecture, at the moment the kid was confused, she would blurt out and say, "Wait, I don't understand that," and would stop the entire class because of something she didn't understand, and which is not necessarily an issue, but it happens several times within 5 minutes. It does become more problematic. Now, while you do want her to understand what's going on and to not feel like she's lost, you can't disrupt the class and the flow of information every 5 minutes to explain something for one person. And so what we did here was put sticky notes on her desk so that she could write down the point at which, taught her to use keywords. So if they're talking about ocean creatures, she just jot that down, because that's the point at which I don't understand what you meant when you said this. And then the teacher has time at the end of class to go back over all of these Post-it notes and everything that's on them to explain it again. And even sometimes allowing the child to tape record lectures even, so that they can go back and listen to it once they have the clarification that they need to understand it. Sustained attention. Now, so this really refers to the capacity to attend to a situation in spite of distractions, fatigue, or being bored is not your favorite topic. So this, with kids, looks like just a complete inability to finish anything. They start things and they don't finish them. They start cleaning their room and it's not finished. difficulty listening to instructions, and you have to repeat the instructions. I don't know if you've ever talked to that person who you're talking to in a conversation and they can't even sustain attention to your conversation for the entire time. So this is one that's very easily noticeable and very susceptible to distractibility by higher interest tasks or something else going around in the area. Again, this is very, very common in individuals with ADHD. With adults, it shows up a lot too, because they often complain to me that they can't finish a book, and for once they would just like to get through a book from start to finish, or they have all these tabs open up on the computer. So if you look at your computer and you have 10 tabs open and nothing's really resolved within those tabs, you might have some issues with sustaining attention. So strategies for that we typically like to do is using timers are a good way to improve sustained attention. And sometimes you need to work at this and build up sustained attention. So using a timer and getting a kid to work for 10 minutes, for example, on math problems. So you keep your pencil on the page, don't look up, just keep working until the timer goes off for 10 minutes. And so you're really practicing building up that sustained attention. And oftentimes we're not really focused on if it's right or not. We're focused on the habit and the behavior of sustaining attention to a task for a long period of time. If 10 minutes is too long, back it up to 5. It's about finishing from start to finish whatever that goal is that you set for sustaining attention and doing it. If they can accomplish 5, then go to 6 and then 7, okay, to build up that ability to work on something from start to finish without stopping.
Could I just ask a quick question?
Mm-hmm.
Would you use a timer, or would you ask about sort of goal setting with intrinsic motivation? So it's like you could do the timers, because some kids don't have intrinsic motivation, so the timer is good, and then you can get data by adding time. Or would you say to a student, like, what's your goal to finish a small chunked set and then work on that? Or do you think either are just as good? Or
I do. Some kids have intrinsic motivation. They're very, very motivated by grades. They really want to get it done. And if you sit down and talk about goals with them, they sometimes can accomplish that. However, some kids cannot. And particularly for kids who do have other impairments like an attention disorder, and it's just very difficult to get things done. And so when that's the case, you sometimes have to back up. And the reason that I say timers, there's these timers that are visual. Right. So it's not like the kitchen timer that sort of dings, but I prefer the timers just because they're so visual. You can see the red going down, so you see how much time you have left.
Yeah.
They're just working towards that time. And I think if it's not visual, it's not important for some of my ADHD kids. I mean, if you can't see it, it's just out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah.
And visual just really allows them to really set some parameters on their own behaviors.
Right.
Sometimes they will need external motivators, like you get to play your video game, so you're allowing access to these more preferred activities after they finish something that might not be as preferred, but it's more important for them to finish. So it's always important. I think your point is very important, that talking with the kid and getting their buy-in, what is your goal? And
right.
Some kids, they don't want to do it. They don't have a goal, but they have to. And so that's when you need to use more of the external motivators. But I think both would work depending on the child.
Yeah, I have 2 kids with ADHD, and I just find with one lately, as he's a little older. So if I do, I'm not joking. The reward is the video game basically at all times. Like if you do this, you get this. But I was doing some timing stuff, and then I found he still wasn't getting stuff done. So I guess what you covered in time management, I was trying to have to bring that in. So 10 minutes worth of work, but how many questions do you think you should be able to do in that time?
That's a good point.
And then if he actually got over, sometimes he was proud. But then also what happened though is then he would do the questions and still have 3 minutes left. And then he wanted to stop. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm always interested in experience.
That's a really, really good point there, because you're also putting an emphasis on, effort. So sometimes he is exceeding the goal. And this happens with kids ADHD kids who are really fast and careless at completing work. And so they have less of an issue with completing it. They just don't care about it. It's all wrong. But they get access to the preferred activity because it's done. And so there you're placing the premium on just getting it done rather than getting it done accurately. And so something like that, where we're just not setting a timer and you just get it done in 10 minutes and you can play your video games.
Yeah.
Get it done in 10 minutes and you can have no more than 2 wrong on the entire page.
Right.
In order to access the activity. And that then places the focus not only on completing it timely, but completing it accurately.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like setting that expectation up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, thank you.
Task initiation. I see this a lot with kids who have anxiety. This ability to start a task in a timely manner without undue procrastination. And some kids are just paralyzed by not knowing how to start, not knowing what to say, what to write. So they wait until the last minute, especially if it's an older kid. They freeze up or don't know where to begin if it's a test. They need reminders to get started. And so one of the things that we do for this, surprisingly, that works really well, is going over and getting them started on the first few items, asking if they have any questions about the assignment and answering any questions they might have at the outset. And so walking through the first step, answering any questions, making help available for kids who do not like to draw attention to themselves by raising their hand, having a little note card on their desk, or even a colored note card. So if it's red, the teacher knows that the kid needs you to come over and to answer a question, or maybe they're stuck or lost. And this really helps to take some of that fear out of getting started for doing something wrong, particularly with the kids with anxiety-based sort of task initiation problems. But then there are also kids who just don't start things because they prefer to wait until the last minute. And for some kids, this works. Sometimes it doesn't always work. It's not always an effective strategy. I've been guilty of this a time or two myself, and sometimes it works out. And when it usually works out, you're not learning from it and not doing it again. But I think that other things like setting timelines and timelines for completion and breaking tasks into smaller parts, which we talked about for another area earlier, is also something that works really well with task initiation. And goal-directed persistence is something that we talked about in a couple of different executive skills prior, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but basically this capacity to have a goal, and again, talking to the student about their goal, what that looks like, following through to completion, and not being distracted by competing interests. So this kid that really struggles with this really struggles to delay gratification. They are not able to stick with it until it's done. And in a sense, a lot of what we've talked about so far is any of those things, everything from the whiteboard to using an agenda or a calendar, those or sticky notes. Those are all things that can be helpful for ensuring goal-directed persistence. The other reason that this is really important, and see if any of you can guess, which EF skill is being utilized when a kid is reading or doing math work or writing? Because the reason this is so important is it's in everything. So it's not just in our ability to get homework done at home or to clean your room like your mom told you 10 times, 3 days ago. it's also in every single thing that the kid is doing in school. So for example, with reading, what executive skill do you think is being utilized when they have to recall previously learned vocabulary to understand something they're reading? What executive skill would that be? Working memory comes to mind. Persistence through distractions. So after reading the first paragraph, they get distracted by something. That's sustained attention. Yep, that's goal-directed persistence. That's sustained attention. What about using graphic organizers to keep track of information they've read? So you're reading for comprehension, and you're making notes. Yep. All of the organizing. Math, you have to recall formulas.
Is that working memory?
Working memory as well. What about organizing information in word problems? And working out a multi-step problem. That's definitely organization and planning out the problem. There's bringing home the math book to complete the assigned math work. So even just remembering to bring the book home is working memory. And writing, keeping multiple ideas in their head at once. Not giving up when frustrated. Getting ideas down on paper. These are all, it involves planning, organization, involves initiation, task initiation, and involves working memory to even retrieve the ideas to get down on paper. And the last one there, how much time you need to finish a paper, for example, or writing assignment by the due date, is task monitoring. So you can see when kids have deficits in these areas, you might see weaknesses and even failing grades in some subjects that are not reflective of their potential or their capabilities, but more reflective of the deficits in executive functions. So the strategies that we want to use in general to develop executive function skills are building up habits and routines. So in the example that we talked about before about tying the shoelaces and driving for adults, these skills are used so routinely that they are automatic at this point. And they were learned through repetition and through consistency, habit forming. And so once you no longer have to think about doing something, you mostly bypass that executive system, and that's where we want kids to be. So we want them to know what they need to do, how they need to set up their spaces in order to get homework done timely, in order to ensure that that completed homework gets to school the next day, and how the next day to make sure they remember to bring home their book and that they've written down all of their assignments. And so all of these things are about scheduling and forming habits and routines that they can stick to in order to make them more automatic in the long term.
So here's a good question that Jane is asking, and I sort of had the same question too. It says, so many of these things are strategies that need to be overseen by an adult, and often the adult in the house has similar executive function issues. So it seems to me like that would maybe be something where the whole family kind of needs to embrace the strategies together. But what do you recommend to your clients for that?
Absolutely. I think that's a very, very key point, and which is, to me, executive functioning and problems in executive functioning creates a problem with time mostly. So the more that you can organize behaviors across and within time. For example, one of the things that worked, because you're absolutely right, it is a whole family thing, and you can get the entire family involved with the whiteboard, for example. and not to just single a child out, but the entire family can go on the whiteboard. Everyone has duties and responsibilities at different times or different days of the week. And so creating a whiteboard, and not just a small one, the biggest mega whiteboard that you can find, and you have it posted very clearly where everyone always has to walk by it and can always see what needs to be done. And you can use whiteboards for morning routines and afternoon routines, or house chores and other types of things. One of the things that a whiteboard will do, because there's lots of conflict sometimes around homework, using a whiteboard really takes the arguing out of it. So the kid writes down the homework and what they have to do and when they have to do it. And therefore the parent, without nagging, can just say, I was just passing by the whiteboard and I see that, and I noticed that you haven't started your math homework yet and it's 7:10. Is there anything I can do to kind of help you get started with that? So it's listed, it's clear, the student knows it, the parent knows it, and it takes out just the back and forth and the potential, for the arguing over goals that are clearly stated and visible. So I think that I hope that answered your question, but there's lots of things that we definitely do around the family, because we really do need the family to help them organize these spaces. And so if we're teaching the kid in session about using a whiteboard and time management and getting things done and having a quiet place to work, but there is no quiet place and kids are running around the house making noise and it's not, there's no importance placed on that, then the kid is going to really have a difficult time complying, with that. Mm-hmm. So we do talk to parents about that. And I do want parents to know that this didn't happen overnight. And so there is going to be some sort of support that's needed on the part of the parent as they're building these executive function skills. But eventually they are learning to do these skills independently, as opposed to what many parents are doing now, which is hovering and doing the work for them, and they never learn the skills, and so they're continuing to do this through high school. And it's not doing them any favors when they get in college and they don't know how to do these things for themselves. So getting homework done involves time management, sustaining attention, initiation. It involves so many different types of executive function skills. So again, using a whiteboard, writing in the time that they're going to start a task, end a task, how long it should take, and then building in breaks so that they are not taking them, whenever, but they are more organized. Here's a sample schedule that I did with a kid. She wrote down the time she thought it should take her. And again, we started with the time that she realistically would be home from school. So you want to learn a little bit about their schedule, their activity schedule, pick up, drop off on Tuesdays, I do this. So it has to be very realistic so that it is applied consistently. And so she's not going to get home till 6. She's usually hungry, so she eats a snack. But at 6:30, she's going to be in place to start. And this is, what she's going to do from 6:30 to 6:50. It should take her 20 minutes. That's her time estimate. And this helped her to be more on track. And here's another student using the same strategy, and she just crossed things out as they were completed. So getting started on tasks, out of sight, out of mind. So develop schedules, develop routines, break down tasks. We've talked about all of these things. Remembering things. These are some common problems I'm going over, by the way. I always hear just forgetfulness. They can't remember to take the permission slip back, and so they couldn't go on the trip, or they're leaving books, or they left their homework, and so they don't get credit, even though we spent all night doing it. And that just seems like such a waste. And so, so I want you to take this with you, this thought that words are a fading stimulus that leaves the listener's awareness as soon as the sound waves dissipate. Okay? So what do I mean by that? Information that you give verbally, it does not leave a trail. And so for these kids, it's so important to write things down so that they can see it. And so seeing their time, whether it's through one of those visual clocks, time timers, teaching memory strategies that compensate for working memory weaknesses, the verbal rehearsal, so saying what you're going to do until you can put your hands on it, electronic reminders at the point of performance, and using a chore card. Here's a chore card or one of the morning routines. There's many, many different ways that you can do this. You can create something like this and laminate it. For younger kids, you can even use pictures because it's easier to see. For kids who need more of a visual, you can do the bracelets. And so on one of the bracelets, it says, do homework. The next one, wash your clothes, put your homework, in your backpack. That should be on the afternoon routine. After you've finished your homework, it is not crossed off until your homework that you just completed is placed in your backpack in the, particular folder where it needs to go to ensure that it does get to school the next day. And the other thing about the point of performance for kids, if they have to remember to take a permission slip, or if they have to remember that they have soccer, so make sure you take your cleats or to school the next day, just grabbing them the night before and putting them right by the door, the same door that they're going to walk out of so that they don't miss it on their way out. So strategies like that are important. And we've talked about this a lot, creating long-term products or projects, creating task lists. Here's a sample project board. So this is something that they have to do. This is what they still need to be done. So here, all of the yellow tabs represent all of the little pieces brainstormed about what it takes to get this assignment done from start to finish. And then they set timelines and parameters of things that are going to be done every day. This still needs to be done. I'm still in the progress of doing this. And as soon as this is done, just carry it over. Okay? And you can always see at any given moment, what still needs to be done and more importantly, what I've accomplished so far. Any questions?
Jane had a comment. She said that, there needs to be some education for teachers as well, that it's not just willful forgetting on the part of the students. But I want to add to that, we have several students where, obviously there need to be some teaching of these executive function strategies happening in school as well as at home. And that usually what we see is that's not really happening, unfortunately. It seems to be an area where schools are not usually stepping up and kind of providing these kind of structured routines.
Absolutely. When a kid is struggling, Attitude Magazine and attitude.com has this really great executive function worksheet. And I can email it to you, Deide.
Sure.
It is so awesome. It has a ton of different accommodations and strategies, and it's specifically for teachers. It has performance challenges related to getting started and finishing classwork, planning ahead, getting organized. They're late with turning in things, completing complex math and algebra problems, and under it, there's strategies and accommodations that the teachers can implement to make performing these skills more easier for the child or teenager. And so I really like this, and I tend to, after completing a psych evaluation, of course, I'm putting all of these accommodations and my recommendations in the back of the report, but also I like to give this sheet and some other sheets just depending on the specific needs of the child, just to give the teacher some direction, because there is not necessarily a requirement for teachers to learn about executive functioning, but it's something that shows up in every teacher's class. And just using these strategies and helping kids to use these strategies when they need them can really go a long way.
I was going to say, I think in the primary grades, you see classrooms are so organized and teachers work on that. And then after, by grade 4, it just seems to be, it gets to be kind of almost a free-for-all. And then if a child has an IEP, if they do list ADHD, I almost find, because I'm a teacher as well, unless you have maybe more firsthand experience or a small classroom, it's a term that gets thrown around all the time.
Yeah.
Like, well, ADHD's got ADHD. But it really impacts children. Like I think the term's used a lot, but then people don't really understand from emotional control, following instructions, impulse control, everything, right? Like that it really is a serious issue for a lot of children.
Yeah, and that's one that we didn't really talk about today, that idea of emotional control, which is an executive function skill, that ability to bounce back from setbacks and not be so upset that you're not able to solve a math problem, or that someone upset you in some way that you've checked out for the rest of the day. And so really being able to manage and control those emotions more effectively, because they will affect your ability to learn and problem solve effectively.
Yeah.
Didi, I know that you're taping and recording this so we can listen to it later. How about the PowerPoint presentation itself? Can we have those papers?
Sure. I'll send that
in a PDF form?
Yeah, yeah.
You really broke it down nicely. I really like that. Thank you.
Great. So we'll be doing more of these, and I would like to know, like, because I love discussing executive function skills, and so if there's a particular sort of presentation that you'd like more information about, whether it's just how other strategies to use with kids, or from a teacher's perspective and things that you can do to implement in the classroom very easily, or just understanding more about what it is and what it looks like, or how to identify it, we can definitely do more of that, more presentations and talks on that.
Do you also talk about ways to help with the emotional control then? How to help children learn to emotionally regulate their behavior?
Yes, emotional dysregulation is huge. I
So
love
you
the
work with that
topic.
also?
We definitely talk about that one too. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Rush. We really appreciate this. Does anybody else have any questions before we log off here?
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you. We'll go ahead and stop recording.